Welcome to Created Healthy. I'm Dawn Combs. It's a common idea that God gave us everything we need in nature, but do we believe it enough to walk that out in truth? Often the very same people who say this go looking for answers on how to use food and medicine from man-made sources. Everything man creates comes with a user's manual. Why would God be any different? I challenge you to join me in seeking revelation about our body, mind, soul, and spirit health by digging into His written word and in practicing pure science in the visible world of His creation. Today's reading has me starting into the book of Judges. I'm in Judges 1 through 3, and the first thing that I kind of stop at is the name of the book. I have looked into this book before, reading a little bit about what's going to be in here, and coming to the basic understanding that this is the period of time in the development of Israel that God was raising up judges. So we started with, we had Moses, and then we had Joshua, and they were leaders, like charismatic, one single leader. And then now we're bringing up these judges. And so the first thing I, of course, want to know is, what is a judge? In my Western definition, I think of a legalistic sort of making sure that people aren't disobeying the law and deciding who's right and who's wrong. And it's curious to me that we would have these sort of, I picture people in robes and being called into court. And why would that be so important in the development of Israel? So going and understanding what the definition of a judge from the biblical standpoint of the time is that these were charismatic leaders that were divinely appointed to return Israel to the right path. They took the form of many different jobs per se. Some were military leaders, some were judicial authorities, some just provided spiritual guidance, but they were a leader, and I think that what we can ascribe to them is that they were leaders who were able to practice what we term as good judgment, sound judgment. And that makes me sort of tumble back into, well, what is good judgment? We want to define that. And that we need to understand that fully, we need to go to childhood development, the theories around how we develop throughout our infancy, our childhood, our adolescence, and into adulthood, and what would be considered adulthood and maturity. Good judgment is something that develops. It isn't something that we are just born with. And I think that's so interesting to look at when we're looking at how Israel is being brought along, and we're looking at what God actually intends. When we were in the garden, he created these beings that were fully endowed with their own choices and able to take on the responsibility of caring for all of the creatures, all of his creation. And that was perhaps Adam and Eve. We've looked at them as this archetype of like the most supremely innocent beings, but perhaps they were just endowed naturally with good judgment, sound judgment. So and then we destroyed it, and they took themselves back to where they were infants, and they needed to sort of get back to the garden. Maybe getting back to the garden here is regaining all of these skills of putting together what would be good judgment. So let me develop that a little bit, because I don't want to run us into the weeds. What is good judgment? It involves the ability to make sound decisions based on careful consideration of information, context, and potential outcomes. So seeing around the corner to, if I do X, then the outcomes might be A, B, Q, Y, or Z. and then planning for what those outcomes might be. Good judgment involves critical thinking, so analyzing situations logically, evaluating evidence and arguments. It involves experience, so being able to draw on past experiences to inform your decisions, learning from successes and failures. Emotional intelligence and emotional maturity, so the ability to understand and manage your own emotions, recognizing the emotions of others so that you can guide the way that you're interacting with those emotions. It involves ethical or moral considerations, so making choices that align with what is truly right and wrong on a moral standpoint, from a moral standpoint, considering the impact of decisions on others, so thinking ahead about what your decision might do to others around you, or even to future generations. And adaptability, so adjusting decisions based on new information or changing circumstances, being open to feedback and alternative viewpoints, being able to take critical feedback, being able to hear you are wrong and taking that in a mature way in order to adjust your behavior and learn from it. And I think back, since we've got Adam and Eve after the garden, everything has been sort of humans going through this process of maturing emotional intelligence, maturing from an emotional standpoint, learning their moral ground, bedrock, learning from experiences. This is why in an oral culture, Moses and Joshua are emphasizing that we have to tell the stories again and again, because the experiences that have happened so far are things that we need to learn about. When we had Moses and Joshua, they were like parents, but they were almost enabling parents. They were infantilizing their people, really wanting them to take on the role of their own critical thinking and their own moral bedrock, but doing the work for them. They were housing the law. Here in Judges 1-3, Joshua dies, and it says that the generation that knew all of these things dies out. And then what you have is a whole group of people that are subject now to groupthink. And this is why basically God understood that these creatures that he had created once outside the garden now don't practice good judgment. He wanted to keep them separated from all the other people that were worshiping local gods and doing things that were going to hurt them, hurt their bodies, hurt their health, hurt one another, because choices wouldn't be made. When you make a choice to burn your infant child, you're not thinking about empathy. You're not making good judgment. So everything so far, as we read through what has transpired to get us to, we're at day 95 of this podcast, is really interestingly like watching the development of a child. Crossing the Jordan was like going into adolescence. You're now going to get more responsibility. I'm going to step away as a parent a little bit, and I'm going to let you take the reins more and try to develop these muscles. And I want you to pick the right people to associate with. I don't want you to mix with them, because groupthink is a thing. It's a dangerous thing. When look at what's happened in our world in the past few years, we had groupthink with a pandemic that allowed people to come together and perpetrate some of the most uncaring, unfeeling, horrific practices and rules that impacted other people negatively. And it was all justified, because when we get into a group as humans, we can really talk ourselves into some really nasty stuff if we aren't good judges, if we aren't if we haven't matured, if we haven't gone through all of the processes that a child and an adolescent advances through to get to adulthood, being able to be a good judge of your life, of the world around you, how your actions are rooted, where you go to find your center repeatedly before you make a decision. You're drawing on past experiences. You're using critical thinking. Boy, that used to be something that was taught in schools, and now everybody's lamenting that critical thinking we've lost it again. So here we're kind of going back into this phase where the Israelites are right now. It shows that this is not what we're struggling with currently is not an isolated moment in humanity. It is something that happens when we aren't mature enough. We aren't mature enough at how we operate in society. We aren't mature enough with our critical thinking. We aren't emotionally mature, and it impacts other people. Yesterday's podcast, I talked about what happens when we don't guard our tongue, and some people who feel the luxury of just being nasty for their own emotional release and not being aware of what that does to those around them. That is an immature judge. That is an immature child who hasn't developed their emotional maturity, their emotional intelligence, and their critical thinking. And it's just it's a developmental level that we are capable of achieving. We're supposed to move along in this structure, which granted, I'm talking about human determination of what this looks like, but I think it's true to watch that there's childhood development, but many adults reach the age of adult without having gone through the process. And here we're seeing Israel struggling with that. We're going to see this as we read through Judges, because immediately after Joshua dies, Israel starts going with the community that they hadn't killed off. There are bad actors, bad influences in the promised land that they did not purge. And as soon as their parent, Joshua, goes, they start looking for somebody else to tell them what to think and what to do. And the people that are around them are serving Baals and putting up Ashtaroth poles, and they followed them. It seems okay. This group think is where they fall back in, and they don't do as their fathers did. So every time they get things too bad off, just like any child, they get into a corner, and their bad judgments have gotten them into so much trouble that there's pain, and the Israelites cry out. And that's when God gives them a new judge. So in these chapters, he does raise up, we see Ehud, a Benjamite, a left-handed Benjamite, and this really kind of funny and graphic story about how he kills Eglon, who was a very fat man, so fat that when he had sunk a sword into his belly, it just disappeared and the fat closed over it. It's definitely a fun story to read, something that you wouldn't expect to be in the Bible. But Ehud is a military leader, but he's able to think around corners. He has developed. He has become a good judge, and God has helped him get there. So I think as we go through Judges, thinking about how are we as a culture stunting people so that they're not developing fully as good judges. We should all be good judges because we have developed good judgment. And it's going to be really important to understand where your moral foundations for that are, and how you use the experiences. What experiences do you use? Who do you have around you? All of these things that we think about in raising our kids are applicable to looking at the Israelites and how God is bringing them along, and also in our own spiritual life. How are we developing from a health standpoint? This is critical for us to be healthy, to have community health, to be operating in the world in a way that is beneficial to us and to others. So I pray that God is blessing you today, and He brings you back again on another day. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share with a friend. And I'm always interested in hearing what God is laying on your heart. So drop me a rating or review, or join the conversation on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube at Dawn Combs Really.